Of course, I've known Jeff Ewing mostly in the World War I American Legion days, but I knew his father and his family over the years, and I think there's some interesting things that Jeff ought to tell us, Penn, as we start out. For instance, Jeff's name is Jefferson Seay, S-E-A-Y, Ewing, and that's partly due to the fact that his father and the territorial governor, Seay, were friends and close associates in the early day. And I think Jeff can give us some interesting information about his father's political and other philosophy because of that name. Jefferson Seay Ewing. What does the Jefferson Seay mean in your dad?
Well, Governor Say's name was Andrew J. Seay, and Father told me that he thought that he would have several sons, and since the governor was such an old friend, that he would name me after Governor Seay. That's why now the Jefferson, I don't know how that got there.
Well, that's a Democratic. That Jefferson is a Democrat, and your dad was a very, very strong Republican. Philosophically, was a conservative, but always was looking out for his own area politically. Where did the Jefferson come from?
I have no idea.
Well, I was interested in that, I thought, but I think, too, Penn, that we ought to get Jeff's father. I doubt if there's been very many of these living legend or other areas that has given a picture of his father's philosophy and the work that he did in the early days, and Jeff gave some of it in this book. Now, this book you mentioned is a book Jeff wrote for his grandkids, and I hope he'll give us some information about it. But it's entitled Oils, O-I-L-S, Well, Oils Well. And there's a lot of biographical data in it, and anybody that wants to check on the Ewing biography can go to either the Oklahoma Historical Society Library, the Oklahoma Heritage Association Library, or the Oklahoma Christian College Library and get that information. But Jeff, give us a little rundown of your dad's activities when he came to Oklahoma and the business he was in. And I remember an incident about selling his business when he sold it.
Well, he was the only one of his family that ever came west, and came out to western Kansas in about 1886 or 7. He was a baseball player, as near as I knew, and came into Oklahoma on April the 22nd, 1889, and settled at Kingfisher. And he and a partner named Gene Brandon had a business of locating these homesteaders on their land. And their business, they had a big buffalo head that they had in front of their office, which I understood was in a tent. Some fella come along and offered them $100 for the buffalo head, and they sold it. And Father told me, he said, when we did, we sold our business. That was our advertising.
He later, though, had some type of what they call a judge's commission from the federal government to settle land claims.
That is correct. It was in Blaine County.
And what area did it cover?
Well, I don't know. It was in Blaine, and Watonga, I think, was where his headquarters were. He was never a judge at Kingfisher as such. However, he did practice law and had an insurance business when I was a boy.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and tell us now when you moved to Guthrie. And by the way, some of your early childhood days, you remember Governor Seay in the mansion that's there at Kingfisher now, and a part of the Historical Society's places of interest in the state. Tell us if you remember anything personally of Governor Seay, and then your move to Guthrie.
Yes, the old governor was very nice to me, and he lived in the old Kingfisher Hotel. In fact, the last few years he was in a wheelchair most of the time. But when I was in military school as a kid up in Missouri, he Governor Seay died, and he left me $250 in his will for educational purposes, which I took and went to school over at Oklahoma A&M. But the old gentleman was pretty elderly, as I remember him, as a boy.
And then you moved to Guthrie.
And when, of course, we moved I was born at Kingfisher and raised there, and then we moved to Pawhuska, lived there a year and a half, and then moved to Guthrie in 1905.
Why don't you describe Oklahoma A&M at the time you were there?
Well, at the time I was there, before World War I, as I remember, we had about 900 students. And I don't remember how big the faculty was, but we didn't have too many buildings. Just a few buildings, and Old Central, of course. We even used that for classes at that time.
Who was president?
Cantwell. President Cantwell.
Jeff, there's some folks, you lived in Guthrie and you lived in right downtown. Tell us about what's there now and what it's close to some landmark.
Well, the old home place was right on Winston Cleveland, the corner of Winston Cleveland, just a block east of the center of town and a block north of the Ione Hotel. And when we were living there as a boy, Father used to have a big rose garden, and I had to take care of it. And he'd sit out there under the shade of the tree and cut these roses off and hand them to the people coming by on the sidewalk going to the stores. And some reporter on that Guthrie paper wrote a story about how much these roses were costing Amos a piece for taxes.
What about the military school?
What about it?
Did you go?
Oh, yeah.
Did you last? Tell us a little about it.
Well, that was way later. I went up to military school on a football scholarship to play football at Wentworth Military Academy at Lexington, Missouri. And we did pretty well the first year and did pretty well the second year. But nobody was supporting me, so I had a little trouble going back and forth. I had to ride a few rods and blinds on passenger trains and freight trains, but I enjoyed it very much.
You went to military school and learned the Army, and then you went to the Navy in War I. Now then, tell us about that and one or two of the interesting items.
Well, I knew what the Army did. They walked. So I went to the Navy where you rode to the fight. And you had a good bed to sleep in and hot meals. So I joined the Navy. But I made the mistake of joining as a fireman. I thought, being raised out here on the prairie, he's kind of like a fireman on a locomotive. He just sat up there and rang the bell and looked out. But I got in the Navy and found out a fireman's a different proposition. First one I ever saw, you had to start out as a coal heaver, which meant you had to carry these cans of coal out of the bunkers onto the fire room floor for the fireman to put in the firebox. He had corns all along the inside of his arm and on his stomach and every place else. So I knew I'd made a mistake. So I immediately transferred over into radio. I knew how to Morse, and I learned the Continental Code and got away from the fireman.
You served on the Mount Vernon, and I think that Hitler sent you a special message about one day out of Brest, France, didn't it? Tell us about that.
Well, we got torpedoed about 300 miles off the French coast one morning. We were pretty lucky. We managed to get the ship into port. Up to that time, has been the only one that ever hit in a vital spot and made port under a Healdton tower. And it was pretty stormy for about 24 hours. The boat hadn't listed, and we had to bail water and come in through the sprung bulkheads and all of those things. But we finally made it in. We all got cited for bravery because there wasn't any place to run. You had to stay there.
Well, now, incidentally, you've given quite a bit of that information to the Historical Society, haven't you? That you've on the Mount Vernon. Then you, after that, did you continue in the Navy until the end of the war?
Yes, I didn't get out until August 1919.
Then what did you do?
Then I came home and went back to work a little while on the on the railroad, I mean. And then I went down to Ardmore to see Mr. Hammon, Jake Hammon Sr., about going to work for him. I'd met him before in 1916 when he was having a political race for the national national committeeman of the Republican Party. And he had told me that time to come see him, but I hadn't gotten around to it till I got back from the war. I went down there in 1st November 1919.
Tell him about Jake Hammon's attending your country meeting.
Oh, well, the way I first met him, he and my father, of course, had been friends ever since early days. And father being a Republican, in this campaign in 1916, Mr. Hammond came up to go to one of these precinct meetings out in the country, and it had been raining for several days. And so father wanted me to take him out, and I got a tow rope and a shovel and everything and started out, and we finally made it to the precinct meeting. And he got the precinct all right, and we got home, but we were the only car present at the precinct meeting. And that was my first meeting with Mr. Hammond.
Why don't you describe Mr. Hammond?
Yeah, now that's what that was the type of person that he was.
Mr. Hammond had the most dynamic personality of anybody I have ever met outside of my ship's captain in World War I. He was not too tall, but he had a very pleasing personality. And you know he's good if he could promote John Ringling of the circus business into the oil business, which he did. And he could really do it.
How did you do it?
Sir?
How did you promote John Ringling?
Well, he just got him to invest in some leases, which turned out to be very, very good.
Well, tell us about now. Mr. Hammond started down there way back in Lawton, and then when did he get into the oil business? Give us a little background on Jake Sr.
Well, he got into it in the Healdton field, is my understanding, early. See, I didn't get down there till 1990. And he'd gotten in the early day and promoted a lot of leases. I mean, to that he would get a lease and organize a company, and they'd drill the wells. And then he had other leases, he'd organize the other company, and he'd promote the money to drill them by each one of these leases being a different company. And he'd been very successful, and of course John Ringling, he had interested him in building that railroad, and he'd gotten him into the oil business to buy some leases which turned out to be very good. One of them was Sarasota lease south of Healdton in section 23. They had 160 acres with 154 wells on it. And then he had some other leases north of town in the old Fox Field, the Brooks lease, which turned out to be very productive.
And tell us about when you went to Mr. Hammond, what the people you contacted, and then the people that you saw, where you landed out at Hewitt.
Well, when I got down there the 1st of November, I went to the Ardmore office and saw Mr. Hammond, and Frank Ketch was his top man then in the office, and so he directed him to send me out to the field office at Wirt, called Ragtown. So that afternoon, Mr. Hammond's big Pierce Arrow touring car, it was one of these 7-passenger jobs with Bill Hinchley, his chauffeur, and Mr. Ketch took me to Ragtown. And I met the field superintendent, and then later that evening he took me over to Hewitt, to the new Dillard field that was just opening up. Little town of Hewitt, which was about 2.5 miles from the field, had one of these oil field boarding houses, and I got set up there, and then reported the next morning on the lease at Hewitt. And my first job was cutting these jack oak trees to clear a location. And they were just as thick as hair on a dog, and it wasn't very nice work. And then we had a big fire, you had to cut them down and cut them up and throw them on this fire. And that was my first job, walked back and forth, night and morning, And the wages was $4. From 7 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening. Every day in the week.
That was how far from your boarding house?
About 2 miles and a half.
Jeff, you was telling about Jake Hammon being in the hooked up with Mr. Ringling. Tell us how Jake, I think you said Jake handled his property, and then he built that railroad and he missed some towns. Give us a little rundown on that.
Well, the Ringling Railroad, of course, was built from Ardmore to Ringling to Healdton. And it was a construction line. In other words, it was under 30 miles in length, so it was not under the Interstate Commerce Commission as to rates. It cost more to send a package from Healdton to Ardmore than it did from Ardmore to Chicago. And the passenger fare was just a little under what the automobile fare was from Healdton to Hewitt, to either to Hewitt or, to Healdton or Wilson or any of those towns. Well, they built this railroad. There was already little towns along, like Hewitt, Old Hewitt, where there was a post office. But he located the town of Wilson about 2 miles west of there and promoted the sale of lots from the town site. And, of course, over at Ringling, there's a little town of Cornish, south of Ringling, a mile, and he wanted Mr. Cornish to give him some land for a town, and he wouldn't do it, so he just put the town up at Ringling, a mile away. And they did the same thing at Healdton, and the old town site office was still in operation when I got there in 1919, selling lots from the town of Healdton. Yet the old town of Healdton, where what had been a post office, was just a mile away. That was
yeah, and but Ringling would buy that property, and then what? Hammond would operate it. Tell us how they operated that.
Well, Mr. Hammond was actually looking after the sale of these lots, but he had other agents to do it. He had Jack Langston there at Healdton. I don't know who they had over at Wilson and over at Ringling. But Mr. Hammond kind of oversaw it or looked after all of it, including the oil property. We operated the Ringling properties until Mr. Hammond died. But after that, the Ringlings took over their own properties.
Did you know Ringling himself? Did you?
Not well. I'd just see him. Every time the circus would come to Ardmore, they'd send passes out for all of us to go to the circus in Ardmore. And he'd say hello to us, and that was about all.
Why don't you describe him as you remember him?
Well, he had a kind of a phobia about growing old or deaf. He never wanted to see anything deaf, and of course I understood he had several faceliftings, and it's pretty hard to tell how old he was. He was a nice-looking man, a tall man, but he was the last one, I believe, of all the brothers that were left. But he never came out to the oil properties. The only time we saw him was when we'd go to the circus.
What role in the Ringling companies there did old Tide Cox play?
Well, Tide, after Mr. Hammond died, Ringling took over the properties, and Tide was the head of them, ran them for Mr. Ringling. He'd been associated with the railroad, too.
Yeah. Give a little history of him, Tide Cox. Who was he?
Well, he was connected with the railroad, and as I said, when Mr. Hammond died, of course, when his stuff went into the estate, and the Ringling took over the operation of their properties, and Tide and his son actually did most of the field work, but Tide was in Ardmore, and he was just the superintendent, I guess you would call him, a manager of the oil properties. Of course, they were all drilled up at that time, but they've since drilled some deeper wells on the Fox stuff up north of Healdton. And I don't know exactly who's running them now.
Well, when you became clerk then and married Maud and moved down there, where'd you go to?
Hewitt, to the Dillard oil field. We had built a warehouse and put 2 rooms on the front of it, one for the clerk to sleep in and the other for a field office. Well, the clerk wouldn't stay out there, and he quit, and the farm boss told me if I'd keep the time and the records and the material and stuff, he'd let me have that room to sleep in, which had a good bed and all fixed up. And there was a restaurant that just opened up there in this little boom town, pretty close, a couple of blocks away. And so I moved out of this long 2.5-mile walk night and morning, and was located in there. Well, then when I'm married, why, they let me have those 2 rooms. So what had been the clerk's office became the kitchen, and what became the office became our living room. And of course, Maud fixed it all up with curtains and everything. That's the only field house I ever saw with white curtains on.
When did you go to Bullhead lease then?
Well, the clerk over to Bullhead of the whole deal, he quit, so they moved me over there for that. In the meantime, I'd gotten
Explain that Bullhead lease on me, so it'd be there. That's
the Bullhead was the headquarters, an Indian lease over at Wirt, Ragtown, and that was the headquarters, the whole field for the Hammon interests. And they had a full-time clerk over there all the time, and he quit. And so I was pretty well caught up with this roustabout thing anyway, and they asked me if I'd go over there and take it, and I told them I would. So I was over there, and we had a little, before Maud came down, she'd gone home when the baby was born, and this was a year later, and had a little 3-roomed house over there, which I fixed up while waiting for her to come, and we moved over there. Then the North End farm boss, he quit, so this superintendent just added that onto my district. So I was a clerk and a farm boss both. But it was all production work in the old Healdton field. But you I saw a lot of people and traveled a lot of miles every day and made all of the oil field supply houses and issued the confirming orders. And the material had been bought and all of those duties, and picked up the reports and everything, and then phoned them into the general office at Ardmore.
Now, on this Bullhead lease, you had this town, this ragtown. Tell us about this ragtown, and then some of these people that told Roy Stewart and me and others about a lot of time.
Well, Ragtown, or Wirt, was located at a crossroads about 2 miles west of the town of Healdton, and the town was built both ways of the crossroad, and part of it was on our lease, which was at the southwest quarter of the section adjoining this 4-way intersection. And
what was there? Kind of tell us what
just
was that
shacks,
ragtown?
just shacks and a grocery store and 3 or 4. Then it came up half a mile along the road on the lease, and of course we had a lot of trouble with them. They were always tying onto our gas lines and for free, and they'd have cows that'd get in your garden, and everything was kind of pain in the neck. But this was an Indian lease, and of course Ragtown burned down ever so often, the business part of town, and unfortunately we didn't have one on our side for quite a while, and it finally burned down. They never did build it again.
That was named for Wirt Franklin, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that was the original well.
Where?
The Wirt Franklin well was in that area, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was right straight south of where I live.
Well, explain that to a little more detail so they can get it off that.
Well,
what was the first well?
Apple Franklin number 1. It was in Section 8.
Section 8.
Yeah. And about a half mile south of the northeast corner of Section 8. And the story was always told us in the field that when they made that location, the teamsters that were hauling out the rig timbers to the location got stuck there, and then with their wagons loaded with this big timber, so they just kicked them off there, and then the rig builders came out the next morning and put up the rig, and meanwhile the contractor saw the rig, so he just hauled his rig in and rigged up, and when they got ready to start, they discovered they wasn't on the location where they're supposed to be, but that's where they drilled the discovery well.
How much did it produce?
Well, I really don't know. See, that was drilled some time before I got down there. But it was still producing when I was there.
That was the Healdton field. That wasn't mentioned. That was Discovery Well of the Healdton
Healdton field, that's correct.
That wasn't the Hewitt field.
No. That was much later. That was after World War I.
The Hewitt field.
Yeah.
Which was the first discovery in southern Oklahoma?
I really don't know. Oh, I think up around Oil City, some real shallow production. The coal line had some over there, I
How
think.
deep was this work, Franklin?
About 1,000 feet.
About 1,000 feet.
Most of the field was that depth.
Give us some of the names that was in with him. You and Roy were talking about.
Let's see, there's Sam Apple and Roy Johnson, Ed Galt, and I believe, what was that other one? Several more. Ed Galt, Sam Apple, Wirt Franklin, Roy Johnson, Eric Dunlap, I believe, was in it.
Dunlap lived.
Yeah.
Promoted.
Promoted the well.
Tell us some of the interesting folks in that old field there that you remember, and some of the interesting items about some of them.
Well, now, one of the early day contractors down there was Hugh Stern, a very colorful old character. And he'd been in there in the early day, and he was a great friend of Mr. Hammond's. In fact, he did a lot of drilling for Mr. Hammond and brought in one of the first drilling rigs in that, the new rotary type of drilling, away from the. And he was a pretty rough guy. Then there was a lot of those other early day there. Ace Michaels was one, and Charlie Murphy was another one. All of them had rigs in that area. Perhaps some of the most colorful people there were the old-time oil field superintendents, like Pete Sheener from the Carter, and Sam Emery, and W.O. Clay of the Shell, and Fred Love for Wirt Franklin. His top man was Mark Feeney. And of course, he had a tool pusher named Larry Boggs, who was a pretty powerful man. Later, Larry was here at Oklahoma City boom before he passed away. Ed Shell was another contractor in that area. Some of those old early days superintendents, Sidney Hernstadt's. That Healdton field was very productive. Some of that stuff on the west side of Section 5 made as much as 100,000 barrels to the acre. What was the old story about it furnishing enough oil for all of the War I operation? Well, that's what they said. That's where the oil came from. It would produce enough to furnish all the oil that they needed. In what? In the United States.
There's a name on your list there of Charlie Goddard.
Yeah.
An interesting thing about him, he was one of the original founders of the Humble Oil Company.
Correct.
Right down in that field.
And he retired when he was about 45 years old. He loved to play pitch. And after he retired, he used to come out to the field. He'd come out where we were on a well, and he'd sit on a nailed keg in that doghouse and play pitch all day with you. It didn't make any difference. For a dime and a dime or 100 and 100, he'd play. He was very colorful. He was later head of the Game Commission here in Oklahoma?
Yeah,
State Game Commission. He had that. He was a great hunter in his day and hunted all over the world, and then became very conservative and had him a big ranch down at Gene Autry and collected all kinds of animals from all over the world.
Ruminants.
Yeah.
Every kind of ruminant he could find anywhere in the world.
That's right.
So one day one of the ibexes or something put him up a tree and he lost his interest.
Was it this Guthrie that his driller asked him about when you had that poor steel in early days?
Oh,
Tell us a little about him.
That was Hugh Sturm. Hugh Sturm had an office man that ran it, kind of ran it, and he when the Illinois field opened up, he decided maybe he wanted to move some of his tools up in Illinois. So he got a hold of his office man and said, Brigance, so what about moving these tools to Illinois? And Brigance said, well, Mr. Sturm, I don't think they'll stand the trip. But he was the funniest old guy you ever saw. I better turn that off. I want to ask you if this is all right. He built there in the outskirts of Ardmore, and this is the truth. He put a crapper on the front porch. That's true.
Yeah.
You all ready?
Go ahead.
Oh, Hugh was a bachelor, and he had his own home in Ardmore, but he had a farm, and of course had oil interests, and of course the farm came ahead of the oil interests. I know one time he drilled a well up in the Tussey field, and it happened that Mr. Hammon, Mr. Cox, had an offset to it, and he drilled it down, set the pipe, and it sat there for a week or two, and every morning when I'd phone in the report, they'd say, well, what's Hugh's well doing? Well, they haven't drilled it in yet. Well, when they're going to drill it, I don't know. So finally the office says, find Hugh and find out when he's going to drill that well in so we'll know whether we're going to have to offset it. So I started out and I finally located Hugh out on his farm. And I said, Hugh, when are you going to drill in that well? Just as soon as I get my oats cut. What's that got to do? Well, he said the well can wait, but the oats got to be harvested.
That was Hugh.
Hugh Stern.
Oh.
He was a hot sketch. The old, I don't know whether the old Magnolia company.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The old Magnolia back in the early days down there, nobody run oil to them because they paid 15 cents under the market for crude oil. They had their own rig builders, their own machine shop, their own trucks. They had, even their tools had odd joints on them so that they couldn't loan anything or you couldn't borrow anything from them and they couldn't use any of your stuff. Of course, we had to have subs made so we could borrow it when we needed fishing tools. But they had some awfully good properties and they ran all their own oil. But we wouldn't buy their gasoline because we didn't like them.
Tell them about those early day rigs and the poor steel that you got in those.
Oh, well, of course, the early days in the drilling business we had poor steel. The pipe was poor grade pipe, and of course all Lapwell pipe, and all the steel was poor. But when the automobiles started coming out real good, along about 1912, 13, 14, they were always having trouble with axles snapping and drive shafts snapping and spindle body bolts breaking. And the automobile people made the steel people start doing something about it. Well, then we commenced to get good steel into the oil industry. Until that time, you had as many fishing tools to try to get your fish out of the holes as you did to drill with, because you had so many failures of steel, and the lines would fail and break.
That's what caused so many crown blocks to fall and get a lot of people hurt.
Oh yeah, just poor steel would break.
Young Jake came into this operation back there, I guess when his father died. Give us your remembrance of young Jake coming into the business.
Well, Jake came down, young Jake, the present Jake Hammon. When his father passed away, shortly afterwards, he was living in Chicago at the time, and he came down to Ardmore and went to work for Hugh Stern, who was a good friend of his father's drilling contractor, and started out as what we call a nipple chaser. That is, a helper to the tool pusher, errands and hustle material and things like that. Later on, I don't know how, he became the administrator for his father's estate. Since he didn't take anything out of the estate because it was so badly involved that there wasn't anything left for him or anybody else in it. It all belonged to creditors. But he became the administrator of the estate. And at the time that he did, I had been seeing him for a year or so, around in the field and visiting with him, and he came to me and wanted me to go with him to look after become his field superintendent to look after these wells that belonged to the estate, which I did. And then that started an association that ran for about 35 years till I retired.
After you moved to Dallas, give us a little brief picture of Jake's expansion and who he went with and Mr. Cox and all that.
Well, in 1926, when the estate was liquidated, he and Ed Cox went into partnerships together. Mr. Cox was a very shrewd, successful lease broker and trader.
Operating where?
At Ardmore. And very, very well known in the industry. And of course, Jake had the organization left over from the Hammon estate, which had been liquidated, and that was the start of a very fruitful partnership. And
before you go down to Dallas, give us a little rundown on Mr. Cox and his ability and knowledge about lease buying.
Well, Ed Cox was one of the best lease brokers in the business in southern Oklahoma.
Go ahead.
And he handled all the leases for a great many of the big oil companies. He was also a banker, having been associated with the banks in Pauls Valley and a wholesale grocery business in Mena, Arkansas. But he'd come to Ardmore and became a lease broker. Well, that made a pretty nice combination because you had to have the lease before you can start to drill the well. And here was a man that could get the leases for you. That, of course, being in the business and doing it for all these major companies, he became well acquainted with all the farmers all over the southern Oklahoma and all the abstractors and so on. So he had an access to information. If anybody made a move in an area, he knew about it very shortly. And that was pretty nice to have working for you, too. And the first well that Jake ever drilled was up at Cox City on Mashburn number 1. Came in on Armistice Day, 1926. And they cut the price of oil 25 cents that day.
But he went on to become then president, the only independent.
Yeah, Jake, of course, has been very active in all of the API, and as far as I know, was the only independent who was ever elected chairman of the board of the API. Of course, another Oklahoma man, Frank Porter, was president of the API for several years.
He also came out of Ardmore.
Yeah, came out of Ardmore. Kind of coincidence, isn't it?
What did Jack Abraham do?
This fella Cox used to be able to put together these leases for folks who wanted to protect themselves. Give us a little rundown on how they used to do that in the old fields down there.
Well, these companies, of course, it isn't this way nowadays, but in those days they would play these trends, say southeast, northwest. And Ed would get these tickets from Shell and Gulf and Texas and all of them. They'd want protection acreage, maybe 5, 10, 15 miles, 20 miles away from the oil field. And they needed this protection acreage because if a field, some guy go out there and wildcat and come in with a well, their board of directors would say, well, boys, are we in out there? And they'd say no. Well, they'd say, get in. Well, by that time it'd get pretty expensive, so they would checkerboard across maybe 15 or 20 miles. Well, that made it, Ed could go buy them a lot cheaper than if a man from the company went out there and they found out who he was, right away the price just went out of bounds. But Ed could buy them on a ticket basis, and gather them all up and get the titles all fixed up and turn them to the oil companies, and they paid him so much brokerage and so much an acre for assembling it. But that made you pretty well known in the country, and these farmers all knew that he didn't have to buy the one on the west side of the road, he could buy the one on the east side of the road. He didn't have to buy 1.5 mile north, he just had to be in that trend. So he was always the kind of a guy that if he told a farmer something, that was it. And the farmer knew it, because they'd traded all through that country. I've seen him buy a man's lease and keep him from losing his farm. It was about to be foreclosed on. He could have bought one across the road, just the same. But he'd buy the one that would help the fellow get his mortgage paid off. But it was, if he'd bought a lease and called you up and that was a deal. If he called you up today and the well across the fence was dry in the morning, that didn't make any difference. You paid off just the same. That was a deal. So when you get set up in an area all over that country that way, why, it's a big help. People know that you're responsible. And that's the way it generally was in the oil business at that time.
Now, that was before computers and that sort of thing, and it took 4 lawyers to approve it.
That's true. A deal was a deal on the phone or any way you made it. But that was a long time ago.
If you remember those old deals, if you remember any of them.
Well, I know at one time that Ed Cox had $1 million obligated for the shell in leases. And he finally called him. He told me that one day. He had to call him up and say, "Boys, I got to have some money. I've used up all mine and all my credit. Send me down some. How much do you want?" "Well, just send me all you got." So I don't know. But that was universally the way it was, and I know that way in the production department too. I've drilled as many as 10 wells with a contractor and never even have a contract. You made a deal with him over the phone, and that was a deal. Or you wrote him a letter and said, "This is it." So there wasn't any signing of any paper around him, but of course they don't do that nowadays.
The only other business I know of today like that is the cattle business. If you say I buy them, you buy them.
You bought.
You say I sell them, you sell them. You sell them then, not something that you want to come back with later. But that's the only other business I know of that'll do that. And incidentally, there we know Halliburton is now worldwide. But how about the first time you saw Earl Halliburton when he was just starting out?
Well, that was in 1919. No, it was 1920, spring of 1920, at Dillard. All Earl had was a wagon, didn't even have a team, had a little old 646 steam pump, and a windmill tank about 8 feet square, 2.5 feet high. And he had an idea that you could pump cement down the inside of a pipe and come back up on the outside of the pipe, and it would set. Well, up to that time, we'd always had, when you drilled a well, you had to have a shoulder to set your pipe down on to shut out the water out of the hole. Well, it happened that they drilled a well with a rotary, one of those primitive rotaries they had, all the way through the sand out there at Dillard, and when they set the pipe down. And Earl come along and sold them the idea that we could swing the pipe, top of the sand, and pump cement down the pipe and come back on the outside. So he brought over his wagon and team. We sent a team over and got his wagon and tank and pump and hooked it up and got out about 250 sacks of cement in the old cloth sacks with wire around the top of them, rigged up his windmill tank. Didn't even have bales that would reach over the swedge in the top of the pipe. We had to use some wire line to make them long enough to reach up here to the hook. Had a flat measuring line that just had a number on it every 100 feet. So we took it out in the woods and drilled a hole in the tree and fastened the reel on it, and then a guy'd take a hold of a number and say, here I go with 100, and the next one come off, grab 100, and we'd walk it into the well. That's the way we measured the cement down on top of the plug after it got in. But we mixed that cement up with hose, and we'd mix up a batch, pretty thin, I guess, probably 15, 16 pounds, I guess. We didn't know. Pump it in, shut down, mix up some more, pump it in, shut down. That's the way we got the 250 sacks in. When we got that in, we took the swedge out and put a plug in and stuck the measuring line through a little place so to get it in there and with a weight on it, and pumped her down and let it set 10 days, and sure enough it worked. And that was one of the early days of Halliburton, but we worked with them a lot in that country because we were drilling up in the county line area in Stevens County and Grady County and around, and they were developing all the time new techniques, and they'd come out and want to try them on the well, and we'd let them try them. I know we drilled a dry hole over there at about 3,500, and they were trying to. So they took the rig over for about a week while they run this tool that they were developing in and out of that well, making logs of it to see how it would work against formations. We knew what the formations were, and they could check it against the log and see if it recorded it properly. So the relationship was very cordial with them. One of the earliest cementers Earl P. Halliburton had was an old boy named Harv Bergier.
Spell it.
I can't. But he later wound up on the guard on the gate as long as he lived over there. But Harvey used to come out the county line, and if you were ready for him to pump the plug for you, that was fine. If you wasn't ready, Harvey went to county line and got drunk. And then when you got ready to pump the plug, you just pumped it yourself. So we knew how to sell to cement pretty good. But they'd fire him once in a while, but Earl P. would always put him back to work. The boss would fire him. That didn't stick with me. But he was the first one they had. And he used to bring students out with him all the time, teaching them how. And of course, he'd just sit up there on the rig floor and throw his voice. Great big old fat boy. But
later, you got to be superintendent for Jake. Tell us about some of the guys that you had on your staff, on your crew. You had some characters on your crews, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. You have them, a lot of them. I guess the most colorful guy I ever had was a big boy named Ed Houston. Well, I had two of them, this same size. And I tell you, he was big. And neither one of them were married. And they didn't make a difference whether you sent them to South Texas, East Texas, West Texas, or anywhere. All you had to do was pay them. And they could get the job done. I know I was over during the East Texas boom, and they went to a dance one night over there in that bottom over there in the piney woods, and the house was sitting up on block on these just sawed off logs, and just stood them up so that when it overflowed, it wouldn't get in the house. Had them up about 3.5, 4 feet off the ground. Little two-roomed house and a big dance, and they went over and kind of got a little tough, and they put them out. So they just went out and shoved the house off the blocks. And of course, I had to outrun them all after that happened. But they could really carry the mail. I moved them in up there. I moved this big Ed up at Tussey when that field opened up in southern Garvin County, and it was a pretty tough area. About as far away from the railroad as you could get every direction, and there was a lot of bootlegging and moonshining going on up there. And he was eating at county line about 3 or 4 miles away over there, and he went over there one evening to eat dinner. He wouldn't hire any of those nesters around there. They didn't like that very well either. He was over there eating dinner, and somebody hit him arm just he went to take a bite, and he said, "Don't do that anymore," and hit him again. He said, "Don't do that anymore." The next guy hit him again, and he just got up and smacked and just knocked him skull, and he had 2 brothers. And they jumped up, so just smack, and they were all on the floor. And by that time, old Ed was pretty well steamed up. He said, now, have you got any friends around here that would like to be accommodated? And they didn't have a friend in the world.
Give a little background on
I don't know whether that kind of stuff what you wanted.
Yes, that's good. And mention the whole name there, Hammon and Cox, because we
Yeah.
kind of get a little mixed up. We young
Yeah.
get over.
Yeah. During the early days of the Cox-Hammon partnership, they bought the Guggenheim, the Gates Oil Company, which was the Guggenheim's oil interests, who were international mining people. And I understand this was the only oil venture they were ever in. It amounted to 156 wells. A lot of them were in the Healdton field, and some were down around Desdemona and Hogtown and Eastland and that country. And same time, we're buying these wells in that Texas area that were drilled down there during the First World War, and most of them were promotional wells that had been financed by stock and then had gone into hands of receiver and had declined, and a lot of them needed reconditioning, and a lot of them had a lot of junk in them where they'd dropped tubing and rods. They had several strings of pipe. We'd buy them for just about what the pipe was worth, and we'd move in on it and wouldn't spend over a few days fishing. If we couldn't clear it up, which we usually could, why, we'd pull the pipe and abandon it and sell the pipe. And we wound up with 175 of them in that country down there, but it had very good gas, very high gas content, fluid content, which made it pretty lucrative, and the oil was very good oil. In that it had a high lube content. The best, only other I ever knew of it was any as well as good was Burbank crude. But this oil at Ranger and Desdemona and in there, the Humboldt would keep it separated and batch it through to the refineries. It was very desirable. Is that all right?
Then this Hammon Cox, after young Jake took over and then got in with Ed Hammond, they actually started in Oklahoma in the Ardmore field.
Right.
Now then they picked up there and went on and kind of give us just a resume here at the end of this, where they went to when you quit.
Well, the Cox and Hammond partnership was really aggressive. It expanded rapidly. We went into West Texas, New Mexico, Southwest Texas, Louisiana, and even did some exploratory drilling over in Mississippi, and of course Oklahoma and Kansas. Not too much in Kansas, but a great deal in Oklahoma. And it expanded rapidly. We had a tremendous amount of production in Southwest Texas, down in Duval County, and lower along the Gulf Coast, all the way from Corpus Christi to New Orleans.
Any Gulf underwater drilling?
Oh yes, we drilled some out in the bays, and in Corpus Christi Bay and Matagorda Bay. Never did get way out in the Gulf. That wasn't going in those days. We were doing pretty well to get out in the Gulf, in the bays.
Cox is passed on, but somebody took over his business. Who is that?
Well, of course, the partnership was dissolved in 1950, and Edwin L., the son, who had come up in the business, took over his father's stuff that was his alone, but the Hammond because Hammon interest was still operated by Mr. Hammon. I retired 14 years ago. I think since that time that Edwin L. has taken over the biggest part of the operation of the strippers at this time. And that was his son who followed Edwin L. Cox. Very successful.
And Jake Hammond has been brought into the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, and you were here and saw that done. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you now live in Dallas. Your son's retired from the Army and lives in Lawton, and your daughter lives in Connecticut.
That's right.
And what do you do for fun?
Mostly nothing.
Still playing golf?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, you have.
You do real well, Jeff.
This is April 5th, 1972. This has been an interview in Oklahoma City with Mr. Jeff Ewing. And making the interview is Milt Phillips from Seminole. Assisting is Roy Stewart from Oklahoma City, or from Edmond.